y'all are doing well. My name is Kathleen and I'm the owner and dyer behind Good Noodle Yarn Co. This morning I am dyeing a colorway called Green Frog. This is a 4-layered process and I'm going to show you all 4 of those layers. I am also going to show you the yarn when it's completed and also a project that I've made out of the yarn. I have 4 different bases here. There are 4 main bases that I dye on, which is the Everyday Sock base, the DK Everyday, and both of these are 75% superwash merino and 25% nylon. And then I have these 2 here, which are my sparkly DK and my sparkly sock. And they are 75% superwash merino, 20% nylon, and then 5% of the silver stellina. And the difference in the dyeing process for me between the yarns that have the sparkle and the yarns that do not is the acid that I use. I use citric acid for both of these with that do not have the stellina. And then for the stellina, I use vinegar instead of citric acid. I found that the citric acid can kind of dull the sparkliness of the yarn. So that's the only time that I use vinegar. I prefer citric acid, but vinegar works well for the sparkly yarn. Now, the way I've done this yarn is I have a little bit of green, which I use as the first layer, which you can see over here. And then I put a decent amount of yellow on it, which you can see here. And then what I do is I put more green on it. So even though it's the same color green, since it's kind of working with the yellow and it ends up being a little bit different. So that's what this is right here. And then I'll show you at the end how we put on the speckles. I'm using 1% stock solution, which basically means for every 100 milliliters of water that I have 1 gram of the powdered dye in it. So that's 1% of that entire solution of 100 milliliters. 1% of that is the actual powder of the dye. And it's kind of a starting point that I use to be able to figure out how much dye I'm going to be using for each of my colorways, because I like to be able to reproduce what I'm doing so that I can continue to make the same colorways time after time and have them as close to the same as I can get. I'm just going to be using a little bit of this dye. The neon dyes are extremely potent and extremely vibrant. And I found that you don't need nearly as much of the neon dye as you do of the regular dye. All right, see, it's just a tiny little bit of this, but I'm going to dilute it with water so that I'm able to spread it a little bit better on top of the yarn. Okay, here we go. So when I have my yarn arranged, I have I'd say about half of the yarn that's sticking up above the water, so that when I pour it will hit right here, and some of that will kind of bind to the yarn right away. And then I kind of push it down under here a little bit so that the dye that hasn't immediately binded will kind of disperse them in the water, so that the water can kind of go up and underneath and around and put kind of a base layer of that light green on. Now the second layer that I'm using is kind of a neon yellowish color, and I've already rearranged this yarn. I'll show you how I do that on the next step. I'm going to push this under a little bit. Just want to take a second to thank all of you all who are here live, and also those of you who are watching this recording later. Thank you for coming by. And if you're watching this after the fact, either in YouTube or in Facebook, you can leave questions in the comments, or you can just send me a DM if you need any help with your own dyeing process or just curious about how I do things. Okay, So this is how I rearrange my yarn. This has the 2 layers on it, which are these 2 layers here. So I pull the yarn out of the water and I move the nylon zip tie, which is what I use to hold my yarn to make it easier to get in and out of the water. And I move that up about, I don't know, about 12 inches or so that the yarn that's going into the water first is a different section of yarn that was just in the water first. And then I kind of pile it up so that the lighter colors that haven't had as much dye are on the top. And there's kind of different parts of the yarn that are showing. I find that I get a lot more of a variegated yarn and less of a stripy looking yarn if I put it in like this. Okay, and like I said, that 3rd layer is going to be some more of this green. It's about twice as much of the dye as I used on that 1st layer. And even though this is my last layer of the actual liquid dye, I'm still going to dilute this all the way, because even though this is, like I said, even though this is my last layer of the variegated one, of the liquid dye, I'm actually using the speckles as my final dye. So I still want this to kind of reach more parts of the yarn than ordinarily I do with this last 4. So I'm gonna let this sit under the water. Okay, so this dye pan right here, which is the Sparkly DK, I have all of the dye has been applied. I did that before we went live. Now, the final step I'm going to put is put some of this green speckles on top. Now, if I were to put the speckles directly on top of here, the speckles would hit the water, they would disperse, and it would be very large patches of the dye, as opposed to more fine speckles, which is what I'm wanting for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour out most of the water. I mean, really, like, just leave gosh, I don't know, less than a centimeter of water in the bottom of this. Also remembering that there's still a lot of water actually in the yarn. Okay. I'm not sure if you can see or not, but the water is just about up to here, as opposed to about here where it was to start out with. So I'm going to rearrange the yarn. I love the kind of greeny yellow colors of this particular yarn. Okay, and I'm going to lay it out a little bit flatter than I normally do, because I'm doing 1 layer of speckles and I'd like as much surface area covered as possible. I think I'm actually going to pour out just a little bit more of the water. Now, when you're using the powdered dyes, it's important that you're using some type of a respirator mask to avoid breathing in the particles. I have a 3M mask that I use. You can also use the N95 masks that are, some of us are wearing now. So my voice is going to be muffled when I have this on. So making sure that your hands are dry so that you don't introduce any moisture actually into the powder. I just go directly into the powder containers. Okay, once you've got the powder so that it's hit the yarn, you can take your respirator off. Now, what I'm planning on doing here is essentially steaming this yarn. So I'm going to put the top on this, turn down the heat so that there's steam that develops inside of this pan, and that's what's going to end up setting the speckles where I want them to be. So you don't need heat very high at all. And the neon yarn in general, but the thing that I was going to say is the neon yarn, or the neon dyes, are they're a little tricky to work with. They're very concentrated. They're very bright. But the neon dyes they're very concentrated. They're kind of tricky to work with. Of all of the dyes, they're probably the least, they take a little bit more time and they take a little bit more acid in order for the dye to completely absorb into it. Actually, with the heat, not everything actually absorbs, if that makes sense. What I do is after I let them go probably for about closer to an hour with the neon, and then I turn the heat off and I let everything cool down completely. And in that process of the yarn cooling, the residual neon dyes go into the yarn, and then everything is solidified. But it really needs that kind of slow heating and slow cooling process in order for them to be set in the yarn, so that you don't have any problems when you're using them. I am going to show you, neons are so difficult to get the colors to show up right on camera. It's just showing up a little bit light. It's actually quite a bit brighter than this, but you can see that you've got the different layers of the yellow and the green. Now the yellow, you don't really end up seeing a whole lot of the yellow. It's just that it kind of gets underneath that. It gets on top of that first green layer, which kind of makes that a little bit more of a yellowy green. And then the green that goes on top of the yellow, it kind of, it just mixes with. So you see very little of the actual yellow. And then these are the little speckles that I put on top. Now I also have a pair of socks that I knitted with this yarn, which you can see here. You can see the lighter yellows and the different variations of the greens. And then you can see these little dark bits right here are kind of where the speckles ended up knitting. I don't think we're going to be able to see the whole thing on here, but. And I use the yarn, it's called Hotsy Totsy. It's part of the Neon Rainbow mini skein set, which I use to do the heels and the toes. This is just the second one, which I'm just showing you so that you can see how similar they are because of how we rearranged all of the yarn. It made all of the colors kind of all dispensed on the yarn fairly evenly, so that when you are knitting with it or crocheting with it or weaving with it, I have weavers that are weaving too, you can kind of see that everything comes out the same on different parts of your project. Bye.